My name is Joseph Drew. I'll be presenting a paper titled Functional Connectivity of the Precuneus in Female University Students with Long-Term Musical Training, written by Tanaka Shoji and Karino Ige, published by Frontiers in Human Neuroscience, Volume 10, June 9, 2016. This study hypothesized that the functional connectivity of the precuneus is altered in musicians. The goal was to examine the effects of long-term musical training on resting state functional connectivity of the precuneus and compare it to brains with no musical training. Now, let us clarify the term resting state. As opposed to paradigm or task-based functional MR imaging, resting state fMRI does not require subjects to perform any specific task. The low-frequency oscillations of the resting state fMRI signal have been shown to relate to the spontaneous neural activity. Does the brain ever go dormant? No, in fact, it's continually the most expensive of all organs. After World War II, we could measure whole brain metabolism and oxygen consumption, telling us how much energy was used.
In new experiments of this type, one can never be 100% sure that there won't be any adverse effects. The worst thing that could have happened would be a cardiac arrest. If that didn't happen, then I was fairly certain that things were okay.
Hats off to the researchers, eh? Our brain uses a lot of energy, perpetually at work, conscious or not. The brain uses a lot. Being only 2% of our body weight, in an adult, it consumes 20% of the cost of running our body. In a child, it can be twice that. Through fMRI data, we are able to compare the brain activity in resting state and brains when stimulated. We compare these two states and see that even when stimuli are not present, spotlighting in the brain still occurs. These parts of the brain that engage, when you're not doing anything, are described as the default mode network. There are several co-conspirators in this functional neighborhood. Your somomotor cortex, dorsal and ventral attention system, occipital or visual system, the auditory cortex, and the basal ganglia are all working together in a way we can observe. So, what is the default mode network doing? Well, it's imagining a view of the world that we apply to what we will interact with. Our view of the world is an illusion that is constructed by our brains. Because of the impoverished data input to our visual or auditory systems, our brain uses mental imagery and episodic memory retrieval. It predicts future events through these dreams, experiences, and problem-solving techniques. So much of what our brain does is non-conscious. Music performance is a great example. We do not think about correct fingerings or the tonality of each note when we perform. It just happens in real time, on autopilot. It's all being processed and done automatically. So this mental imagery is a huge part of playing music. When we are told by producers, conductors, or instructors to deliver notes with conviction and sincerity, with feeling, tangible mental imagery is imperative to this skillful sonic expression. People literally feel touched. The precuneus is a core component in the default mode network. It is the red flag waver, or gatekeeper. It decides what we will associate with or dissociate from in our first-person perspective of what reality is. It is a predictive tool to lay everything out for us before we get there. So if we're all just flesh bags of biology, inventing and living by our own reality, do musicians utilize their default mode network and precuneus any different than non-musicians? To approach this question, our brave and humble researchers gathered two groups, 26 musicians and 26 non-musicians, to compare their brains. University music majors who may not have been inclined to donate plasma were enticed by advertisements to participate in this study that only required functional magnetic resonance imaging while they relaxed placidly to provide a resting state. 26 recruits were chosen between the ages of 18 and 27 for each group. To qualify for the musician group, they had to have begun formal music instruction between the ages of 3 to 5 years old and must have been actively involved in music study and performance from that point of origin to the current year of study. This group of students primarily performed classical music on instruments involving piano, strings, woodwinds, and brass. The other group of 26 were non-music majors who did not play any instruments and had no formal music training. Their disciplines were diverse, ranging from finance to literature, philosophy, psychology, economics, science, and engineering. All 52 participants were healthy, right-handed Japanese females with no history of neurological or neuropsychiatric disorders. Using a Philips Chiva 3.0 Tesla MRI scanner at Juntendo University Hospital, blood oxygen level dependent MRI data were collected, while participants laid in a resting state with eyes closed. Now remember, we said the brain is the most expensive organ to run. It is never dormant. The posteromedial portion of the parietal lobe has traditionally been given very little attention, mainly because of its hidden location. However, in recent years, studies have produced functional imaging findings to show that the precuneus may play a central role in a wide variety of highly integrated tasks. One such study out of the UK in 2006 by Andrea Cavanna and Michael Trimble showed the precuneus and surrounding posteromedial areas were among the highest resting metabolic rates of all the brain structures. Resting metabolic rate, or RMR, is the amount of energy the body needs to function while at rest. Resting metabolic rate is the biggest component of energy expenditure, accounting for 60 to 70% of caloric burn in a 24-hour period. Now remember, the brain never stops, and evidently the precuneus is a busy little fella. Another study in 2011 showed posteromedial cortex to be a hotspot of selective hypermetabolism during altered states of consciousness like sleep, drug-induced anesthesia, and vegetative states. Now, it would be so easy for me to rabbit trail here. To be honest, I have a lot of theories and questions. I would love to know the role of the default network and precuneus in emotional trauma, repressed memories, post-traumatic stress disorder. But back to the study at hand in Japan. Their task was to bring each subject in for about 7 minutes and gather 200 scans. Imaging data were processed, the musician fMRI data were aligned, signal contributions from white brain matter, cerebrospinal fluid, and microhead movement were regressed out of the data. The same was done for non-musicians, and significant differences were seen in the two groups. Using the data, functional connectivity maps were constructed. fMRI scanners detect magnetic properties in oxygenated and deoxygenated blood. Observing the different areas of oxygenated blood in the brain, we can use blood oxygen level dependence, or bold contrast, as a method to identify which areas of the brain are most active. When areas light up the same way at the same time, we can see the connectivity exists. Since our brain consumes more energy per gram than any other organ, it is highly dependent on a reliable and tightly regulated blood supply. When neurons engage to perform a particular task, chemical changes dilate regional arterioles, supplying the necessary energy and oxygen. MRI can be used to measure this vascular response to localize these differences in oxygenated and deoxygenated characteristics. When a neuron activates, it demands more blood oxygen levels. Support cells around the neuron release chemicals that dilate the arterioles and supply the neuron with the needed blood oxygen. Even though this is actually burning more energy than in resting state, the increased blood oxygen volume is more than enough to meet metabolic demand, and we see a reddish increase in the downstream vessels. Not what I expected, but that is what happens. In resting state, the incoming highly oxygenated blood is red, the neurons extract what they need, and the venules appear blue. So, like Toucan Sam on the Fruit Loops commercials of the 80s, follow your nose, stick 'em in the scanner, and see what glows. Now, without wading through a perennial pool of details, drowning in scientific and neurological jargon, allow me to shuck the corn and tell you how the cow ate the cabbage. We have line A, which is the compiled musician brains. Line B is the non-musicians. Line C is the difference between the two groups. So, figure C highlights only the area of the brain that is different between the two groups. In resting state, when you're doing nothing, it's the precuneus. Our researchers hypothesized that musicians have a larger number of connections originating in the precuneus because that part of the brain is required to form mental images imperative to skillful music performance. The fMRI images show that plainly. How this relates to the default mode network is mentioned in the research results as well. The precuneus is only one part of the default mode network. There are multiple other parts besides the precuneus. Overall, the default mode network generates spontaneous thoughts, daydreams, and it's where creativity happens. The precuneus specifically performs and processes mental images of those spontaneous thoughts and dreams. The authors of this study theorized musicians would unconsciously utilize constructive processes when creating mental imagery during performance that enable them to visualize the entire course of a performance and to create sounds that represent his or her mental images. Therefore, we predict that the functional connectivity of the precuneus is altered in musicians. As a musician, I hold these truths to be self-evident, that visualization, imaginations, emotion, and feeling are all woven together in the tapestry of musical artistry. All these parts of the default mode network are involved, and as a musician, we are so wired that way that even in resting state, this higher functional connectivity is apparent. Science is a rigorous systematic endeavor that builds and organizes knowledge in the form of testable explanations and predictions about the observable world, so my impulse or beliefs do not hold weight. What science and I have in common is that when the opinion changes, it only means we learned more. The fMRI images from this study seem to confirm that there is clearly a difference in the isolated area of the precuneus and its functional connectivity in musicians compared with non-musicians.